Senators, I attend the Senate in conformity with your notice for the purpose of joining with you for the trial of the President of the United States.
For only the third time in U.S. history, the U.S. Senate prepares to hear an impeachment case. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. The Chief Justice of the United States, along with U.S. Senators, took a special oath on Thursday to hear the impeachment trial against Donald Trump beginning on Tuesday. The U.S. President is accused of abuse of power and obstruction of Congress related to his withholding military aid to Ukraine and pressuring Ukraine to investigate his political rival, former Vice President Joe Biden. Trump has until Saturday to submit his formal responses against him, but is already lashing out against the trial.
It's a hoax. It's a hoax. Everybody knows that. It's a complete hoax. The whole thing with Ukraine. So you have a perfect phone call. This is a call, fortunately, it was actually two phone calls. You people don't report that. There were two calls. They were both perfect calls. In fact, probably among the nicest calls I've ever made to foreign leaders.
All right, let's bring in our panel for more on the impeachment. Joining us from New York is John Burnett. He's the managing director and founder of One Empire Group, a consulting firm. Here with us in the studio is David Charter. He's the U.S. editor of the British newspaper, The Times. Also with us is political analyst and longtime journalist Steve Chagaris. And from Babylon, New York, Christopher Hahn is the host of the Aggressive Progressive podcast on Revolver. Thanks to all of you for being with us. John, let me start with you. The trial of Donald Trump will start next week. Let's look at the optics of this. No matter what the outcome of the trial, looking at the optics and the fact, as we've just reported, that this is only the third president in the United States to face this kind of trial, is it going to hurt Donald Trump and possibly his chances for re-election? John, can you hear me?
Actually, I don't think it'll hurt his chances of re-election. I think, if anything, what we've seen is that his fundraising has been boosted from these shenanigans by the Democratic Party, and his favorability rating in terms of approval rate is actually skyrocketed. So I think this has actually helped him. When voters go to the voter box in November, what they'll look at is their pocketbooks. They'll open their 401k and retirement statements. They'll look at the economy, and they'll just simply answer the question by saying, you know what, I am better off over the last 4 years than the preceding years. So I think, they'll actually vote with their pocketbooks, not with, the Democratic rhetoric. And we all know how this trial will go. The Senate is in full control of the trial. If witnesses are called, I think that what the Republicans will do is require Joe Biden as well as Hunter Biden and possibly the whistleblower. If not, then I think it'll be a speedy trial and ended in short order. And I think, we'll be back to business of making America great again.
Christopher, does John have a point there that the impeachment is just a sideshow, really? And when people actually look at Donald Trump, they look at his economic record, and that's what they'll be considering when they vote in November this year.
I mean, given the economy the way it is in this country, you would think Donald Trump would have a 60% approval rating. In fact, his approval rating is at 42% to 44%, where it's been for his entire presidency. Impeachment and the way this president behaves is why this man will not be reelected under any circumstances. The president was impeached for violating his oath of office, and the Senate may not throw him out because Mitch McConnell and the other Republican senators fear the president's wrath and the wrath of his base. But it will be a stain on this presidency, and the voters will remember it when they go to the polls. In fact, the voters in this country are exhausted by this president, and regardless of how well the economy's doing, an economy that Barack Obama created, they're going to vote this man out.
David, what's your view? Is this a man who's going to be pushed out of office because of what is taking place right now, or will people be looking at his economic record?
I think what we've just heard explains why the election later this year is going to be very hard to call, because there's no doubt the economy is doing great, and it gives Donald Trump a lot to boast about. But I think there was evidence from the midterms in 2018 that voters didn't like the tone of this presidency, suburban voters, I should say, not those who are committed to Trump voters in his base.
Yeah.
And we saw a swing in suburban areas, especially among suburban college-educated, more female voters, away from Donald Trump. And this isn't going to do anything to win those voters back.
Right, David, let me ask you about this, and this is drilling down a little bit into the impeachment case itself. There's been a lot of excitement in the United States media over the past few days about a man called Lev Parnas, who's an associate of Rudy Giuliani, former mayor of New York, and Trump's personal lawyer. Parnas alleges the president knew exactly what was going on in Ukraine. What are we to make of this? Because Parnas is not exactly Mr. Clean. I mean, he's got a pretty sordid record here. He's been wanted on multiple charges. He was also arrested trying to flee the United States.
Right. I don't think this plays very well for Donald Trump, because the more that he says he doesn't know this guy and he's never spoken with him, the more this Lev Parnas seems to be tweeting out photographs and video of him socializing with Donald Trump. And it's pretty clear from the documentary evidence that's been produced by the House that they've obtained from Lev Parnas that he was Rudy Giuliani's right-hand man in Ukraine. And Rudy Giuliani has, there are letters from him showing that he's acting as the president's personal lawyer in a personal capacity in Ukraine, trying to put pressure on the government for Donald Trump. And these go to the heart of the charges against the president. So if in the Senate trial, the Democratic managers can paint a direct link between Parnas, Giuliani, and Trump, then I think it's bad news for Donald Trump, because this, as you say, he is a shady character, but that doesn't reflect well on the fact that he was employed and associated with Giuliani, who was employed and associated with Trump.
Right, but Steve, isn't any defense lawyer going to call into question the guy's integrity and character?
Absolutely, and the credibility question is always going to be there with him. But to the point of the Democrats making that connection, that's where they've really failed generally, I think, throughout this whole impeachment process, is they have been unable to make many connections directly to the President of the United States. They've got connections to all the people around him, Giuliani, Mick Mulvaney, you name it. But Trump, the only real connection they have is that phone call he made. And so I think that's what's giving, it's sort of leading a lot of doubt in people's minds as to whether the president really is as guilty as the Democrats say he is.
Okay, Steve, I don't want to get too much into detail here because we're talking to a foreign audience, but let's talk about this trial, this impeachment trial that takes place in the Senate. We don't have too many details on how this trial will be conducted. Let's listen to what the Democrat minority leader, Chuck Schumer, had to say about that. Let's watch this.
Leader McConnell is fond of citing precedent. We've all heard him about 1999. The precedent in impeachment trials in the Senate is to have witnesses. To have no witnesses would be a dramatic break with precedent.
So when it comes to the trial, I mean, are we going to see a trial with the witnesses and evidence being presented and cross-examining, all the trappings of a normal criminal trial, or is this going to be different?
Well, they talk about precedent. Let's keep in mind there's really been one other impeachment trial in modern American history, and that was in 1999. So the precedent, there really isn't a lot of precedent there. And what McConnell has said is he wants to structure this.
The Senate Majority
Leader Mitch McConnell wants to structure this like it was structured in 1999, which is get the trial up and running, and then after you've heard the arguments from both sides, then the senators decide whether they want to hear from more witnesses. That's what was agreed upon in 1999. That's the way Mitch McConnell wants to take it this time around. Democrats say, well, wait a minute. You've got people like John Bolton, the former national security advisor. You get now people like Lev Parnas coming out and saying all this stuff. Maybe we want to hear from some other witnesses, and we want to get this going up and running sooner. They're going to need some Republicans to join them on that if they want to get that going early. Otherwise, it's likely to wait until after the arguments are made in a couple of weeks.
All right, John Bennett, there were more problems for the president earlier this week. There was a report out, a government report, which said that the fact that he withheld aid from Ukraine was breaking the law. How big an issue is this going to be for him?
I don't think it'll be a big issue. You know, when you look at history, recent history, there were two situations with regard to President Barack Obama that the GAO came out with its opinion that he broke the law at least twice when he actually gave out money to insurance companies. They claimed that he broke the Affordable Care Act. Also, when he negotiated the hostage exchange in the Bergdahl case without congressional approval. So the GAO has come out against previous presidents in terms of their finite opinion with regard to infractions of law that had no repercussions on any prior president, the two examples I just gave you. So I don't think this will actually go anywhere with respect to President Trump in this trial or outside of this trial.
Christopher, is this a non-issue? Because as John points out, there were accusations that Barack Obama had broken the law as well. In fact, on this particular issue, it was also Barack Obama who withheld aid, military aid from Ukraine.
You know, this is only the smallest of the laws that the president has broken. The president has broken other laws. He has violated his oath of office. He tried to get personal gain by withholding that aid. That's the bigger problem. That's the question. You played a clip from my former boss, Chuck Schumer. The question that we've got to get to in the United States Senate is whether we are going to take action against a lawless president who will avoid the checks and balances and the safeguards put in by the United States Constitution to protect us from tyranny. So, while I respect the GAO decision, I don't know how much that adds, because what we've learned with Donald Trump is it's just one more log on the fire of lies and corruption and deceit and problems he's causing for the American people. So, that's just one more thing. I don't know if it's going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back, but I'm glad that straw is there.
Okay, Steve, here we hear, all these charges piling up against the president. But we look at the poll numbers, his approval numbers, they're low, but they've not shifted any lower. How do you explain that?
Well, what's happened is that Republican voters are steadfastly behind this president, no matter what is thrown at him. 9 out of 10 Republicans support the President of the United States. I think there was a hope among Democrats that all of this information coming out in this impeachment investigation and now in this trial would sway some Republicans who might not like the president as much over to their side and have them raise some questions about this president. But what you're seeing is just no movement at all among Republican voters. And that really gives not only the president a boost, and you're seeing that in fundraising with his campaign, but it gives Republican senators and members of the House a lot of political cover to stand behind this president and say, look, we're going to support him until the ends of the earth because Republican voters, our base, is supportive of him, 90% support.
Go ahead, Christopher, you want to say something?
I mean, I wouldn't call it cover. I would say that they're afraid. I mean, they're afraid of being primaried more than they are about getting reelection. And for some of them, it becomes a difficult choice. Yeah. Martha McSally, Cory Gardner represent purple states. And while they might avoid a primary, they're going to have a harder time getting reelected. Yeah. And that puts Mitch McConnell's entire majority in jeopardy, which is why they got to have a fair trial, because these people, their seats are on the line.
All right. David.
Can I just respond?
Very quickly, John.
I completely disagree with Chris. As we've seen with the 2 prior presidential impeachment processes, the thing is that there were crimes noted. In the articles, 2 articles of impeachment, there are no crimes alleged. So while Chris in the Democratic Party are trying to paint this pretty picture, it's all crumbling apart. Why? Because as President Trump says, when you look at the transcript, when you look at everything in its totality, there is nothing there except the hatred for this president.
Bottom of page 3, top of page 4 of the transcript.
Okay, I want to get to David. David, notwithstanding all these very fine legal arguments that we're hearing out there, I mean, impeachment is a pretty serious business. You're undoing the will of the people here, and there are some who've said, look, there is a trial that's going to take place, and it's going to have millions of jurors at the end of this year, in November. Why not leave it to the people to decide whether they want Donald Trump back or whether they want him to out of office?
Look, I think it's quite a powerful argument, but I think the Democrats have made quite a strong argument in supporting the impeachment process, in saying that the whole point was that President Trump's meddling in Ukraine, if you like, was trying to get material to influence the 2020 election with a surreptitious advantage that people didn't really know had been fixed by him. And if Ukraine came out and did say that the Biden family was being investigated for some sort of nefarious activity in Ukraine, if it hadn't been exposed that this had been encouraged by the president's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, then that would have so the Democratic argument goes, have given the Republicans an unfair advantage in the 2020 election, which had to be exposed and confronted. And just to go back to the point about the GAO finding of illegality, that goes to the point that there isn't any criminal any criminal breach in the impeachment charges or articles, because this is actually now a breach of the criminal code that has been decided. So I do think that does carry some weight.
There's to your other point about why not let the voters decide. There's polling that shows, one, that Americans believe the president did do something wrong here, potentially illegal, but the polls also show that Americans say, leave it up to us. We want to vote in November, and we're the ones that want to decide this. And so it's an interesting question, but it seems as if Americans want to be the ones that have the final say here.
But they need the facts in front of them, don't they? And more facts must be a good thing, I suppose.
Sure, but I think they'll make, they want to make the decision ultimately. They don't want Congress to make the decision of whether this president should stay in office.
Yeah, they won't though, will they?
All right, Christopher, let's move on to the Democrat nomination race. 6 of the candidates, we saw them earlier this week on stage in Iowa. That was the last debate they held before voting begins in the primary process. But it was overshadowed quite a bit by this squabble that we're seeing between 2 of the leading candidates, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. Warren alleging that Bernie Sanders once told her, Warren, that a woman could never become president. He denied it, and it led to an exchange after the debate. Let's listen to part of that exchange.
I think you called me a liar on national TV.
What?
I think you called me a liar on national TV.
Let's not do it right now. You want to have that discussion, we'll have that
Anytime.
discussion. You called me, you told me. All right, let's not do it now.
I don't want to get in the middle of it. I just want to say hi, Bernie.
Yeah, good. Okay.
So, Chris, what did you make of it? Did it hurt Sanders? Did it hurt Warren? Did it hurt both of them? Did it hurt the Democrats?
Poor Tom Steyer getting in the middle of that, right? I mean, did you see him? The poor guy, he was like a deer in the headlights. I felt so bad for the guy. It's the first time I felt bad for him the entire campaign. I don't know what to make of that exchange. I think that when politicians try to play pundit like we're doing right now, they get themselves in trouble. I don't know what Bernie said to her. I know what she heard, and I believe them both. So, and I think most of the voters in that camp are looking at that saying, what is this all about? The thing about Iowa, though, is Iowa wants their candidates to get along. They want nice people. And a lot of the time, people don't reach viability in these campaigns in Iowa. And you want to get the second choice, and you want to be that second choice. And if you're seen as mean, you won't get that second choice. So let's say Warren isn't viable in some precinct. Bernie might not be able to get those votes. Those votes might go to Klobuchar or somebody else. And same thing with Warren. Her people might not want to vote for Bernie should she not be viable in each precinct. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of precincts in Iowa, and you've got to reach a 15% threshold in each precinct to be viable. So that matters in a big way.
John Burnett, you, of course, are the outsider looking at the squabble going on in the other camp, the enemy camp. Does this internal fight hurt, at least help Donald Trump?
Well, when you look at the situation, we have 2 different versions, but you know what? The truth only happened one way. So one person is telling the truth and one person is lying. But when you look at Bernie Sanders' record, there's nothing in his past that would lend credibility to Elizabeth Warren's allegations. So I kind of side with Bernie. And you know what? Given the fact that she's falling in the polls, her fundraising is not doing well, she's trying to has the same message and platform as Bernie Sanders. She's trying to push him out the way, but you know what? She's faltering. I see this as an attack on Bernie. And as many of the political pundits have said on many of the shows and networks the day after, you know what? This doesn't look good for the Democratic Party. It looks like a lot of infighting, and it's going to be tremendously hard to coalesce the party afterwards.
Such nonsense.
Because Trump's going to use this, isn't he?
Well, sure, but I think the bigger issue here is that as we mentioned, Sanders and Warren are fighting for the same voters. But now what you're doing is you're creating animosity on both sides. So there's a fear among progressive voters, or among progressives, that if you create this major split and animosity on both sides, if one of the 2 gets some momentum, then the supporters of the other aren't going to come on board because they don't like. So, for instance, the Warren folks will not like Sanders because of what happened here. Or the Sanders folks wouldn't like Warren. And the person who's sitting back and enjoying this the most is Joe Biden, because at the end of the day, if there's a split among progressive voters, then perhaps the moderate, and the strongest moderate right now is Joe Biden nationally, perhaps he's the one that benefits from all this infighting.
Yeah.
And I just think that this week there was another opportunity for...
John, one moment. Go ahead,
I just think this week there was another opportunity for Bernie Sanders to capitalize on this and show he was like the most authentically progressive candidate when he voted against the big trade deal, the USMCA, in the Senate, and whereas Elizabeth Warren voted for it. And he said he wouldn't vote for any deal that had any that didn't help workers to the extent that he wanted them to be helped.
And the environment as well.
And that was why some others voted against it as well. And I also think it brings a new focus on the differences between Warren and Sanders. For example, with health policy, where Warren has really backed away from the most sort of authentically progressive measures, if you like, that Bernie is espousing.
Medicare for all, yeah.
Correct.
David, the other thing is there's an interesting dynamic going on with the polling. If we look at the polling after that debate, this was an Ipsos Reuters poll, it showed that Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden were tied neck and neck. And they come from really extreme parts of the Democratic Party, don't they?
Right, they do, but I don't think it's being looked at from a policy perspective so much as a who can beat Trump perspective. And what we've also picked up from Iowa is that people are thinking, I could go for Bernie or I could go for Biden, whichever one is most likely, I think, to beat Trump, regardless of any of the policies that they're espousing, just simply of their national appeal.
Sorry, John, go ahead.
Yeah, the thing is, I think Steve made a great point earlier with regard to Bernie and Elizabeth Warren. And we all know that Elizabeth Warren has really not told the truth in the past. So, her credibility is really shaky. And when you look at, Biden's base, he's holding on to the black vote. And when you look at Bernie, he already had a strong operation, a ground game from 2016. And there are people that are extremely loyal to Bernie. So that's the reason why Bernie hasn't really fallen much. But we've seen different people from other camps, as the candidates drop out of the race, they're actually looking at who's at the top, and they're seeing Biden and Bernie Sanders.
John, as far as the African-American vote is concerned, I mean, the conventional wisdom is that Biden is doing better than Sanders. But there was a poll out earlier this week from Vice News which showed that Bernie Sanders is doing as well with African-American voters, or in fact, even better than Joe Biden.
Yeah, let's not forget, there are people like Keith Ellison, and there are other individuals within the black electorate in key states that are still holding very close to Bernie Sanders. And there are certain black cohorts that, when they look at Vice President Biden, they're thinking about the Obama days. They're having, flashbacks, based upon what they thought about that administration. They're actually, there's a tug of war going on between the two for the black vote.
Yeah, I want to get to the next issue here, Steve, and that is the issue of America's endless wars. The candidates on that debate stage also discussed that. Let's watch.
We should stop asking our military to solve problems that cannot be solved militarily. Our keeping combat troops there is not helping. We need to work with our allies. We need to use our economic tools. We need to use our diplomatic tools.
We can continue to remain engaged without having an endless commitment of ground troops. But what's going on right now is the president's actually sending more. The very president who said he was going to end endless war, who pretended to have been against the war in Iraq all along, though we know that's not true, now has more troops going to the Middle East.
The American people are sick and tired of endless wars, which have cost us trillions of dollars. Our job is to rebuild the United Nations, rebuild the State Department, make sure that we have the capability of bringing the world together to resolve international conflict diplomatically.
And of course, Donald Trump, Steve, came to office promising to end all these endless wars.
Sounding a lot like those Democrats, right? Which surprised a lot of Republicans and others.
As Buttigieg just pointed out, he's dispatched thousands more troops to the Middle East. We just had news over the past few days that there were American soldiers hurt injured in that missile attack that Iran launched on bases in Iraq. Is this going to be an election issue? Does the U.S. run the risk of being sucked into another war again?
Well, it could be an election issue. I mean, if you look at the polling immediately after the Iran dust-up, Americans are not fans of this. And this is exactly, I think, the opposite of what Donald Trump said he was going to do when he was campaigning in 2016. But it's unclear what his strategy is moving forward. And I think that has a lot of people in Washington scratching their heads, wondering what is the president doing here? Is this just foreign policy, shooting from the hip? I think a lot of people think that that's what's going on here. He's just sort of making it up as he goes along. How Americans are going to react to that in November is a big question. But if people voted for Donald Trump, if one of the reasons they voted for Donald Trump was because of his promise not to keep America in these, quote, endless wars, well, this is going to raise a lot of questions with those voters, and he's going to have to answer those questions.
Yeah.
John, one other big achievement for the president this past week. He signed that trade deal with China, phase one of the trade deal, as it's called. He's also due to sign the revised NAFTA agreement, which is going to be known as the USMCA. I mean, these are big achievements for him. Is he going to tout this as he campaigns?
He's going to tout these two great achievements, promises made, promises kept. You know, with regard to the U.S.-China trade deal, you know, as the president always says, you know, the best negotiation is a win-win. And I think this is a win-win for both countries. Yes, China will purchase more than $200 billion worth of, you know, crops, energy, services, and manufactured goods, and also stop the IP theft and doing a lot of other things. And let's not forget, President Trump is keeping tariffs on approximately $375 billion of Chinese goods. Why? Because he's going to use that as a tool to negotiate phase two. And let's not forget, you know, the Chinese economy was doing tremendously well before these trade negotiations started. And you know what? The Chinese government wants to continue to grow their middle class. Why? Because they're doing well.
Okay, I've only got a minute left. And Christopher, I want to get your view on this. I mean, is there a disconnect here between the Democratic Party and voters? Because there we have, you know, we see on our television screens Donald Trump signing trade agreements. On the other side, we see Nancy Pelosi signing impeachment papers. Isn't this a problem for Democrats?
I don't think it's a problem. Look, that trade agreement was an agreement that was forced because the president caused problems. The president hasn't kept promises, particularly we're talking about endless wars. One of the things I liked about Donald Trump was that he said he would keep us out of stupid wars. And the guy almost started one of the most stupid wars in the history of this planet. So, and maybe we might still get that. Foreign policy by gut check is never going to work, and the American people are afraid of Donald Trump. He could destroy everything going on in this world by a tweet.
All right.
Time for him to go.
We are going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. Before we go, we invite you to listen to the Heat podcast. It's available through Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. We cover similar stories from around the world, but get a bit more personal and candid with guests. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.